in putting that together. And if you're not on that list, we recommend you get on that list, because every 2 weeks we have a different issue around foreign policy that we look at, and then have a discussion, and then we take action, because we are all about action. And that is why I'm doing this book tour, because I don't know about you, but I'm pretty scared about the direction that this world is going right now. And it seems like we can go in two very different directions. One is a path towards nuclear war, which I know that we don't want to go there. And the other is a path where we figure out how to work at the negotiating table and make agreements and get along, and then start working on the real issues that we have to address, which is the climate crisis, as well as issues like racism, and how do we make our military, how do we shrink the military and put the funding into things we need. It's so sad in a college town like this, where students have to fight to have the ability to go to college, when I have seen in my lifetime so many other countries that are much poorer than the United States, that not only have free education up into PhD, doctor, whatever you want to become, but a stipend so that you can live while you're getting your education, because those societies understand that we need well-educated young people, and it's in our interest as a society to provide them with those opportunities. So obviously we are a very backward nation when it comes to taking care of the planet and its people. And we are a very backward nation when it comes to learning how to negotiate and talk. And when you look at the Department of State, it might as well be a appendage of the Pentagon, because really, they don't do a negotiating. I mean, have you seen Secretary of State Tony Blinken negotiate with Lavrov, or anybody that could help find a solution to the Ukraine crisis? Certainly not. And when it comes to funding, if you look at the funding for the State Department, we've spent about as much on Ukraine right now as the entire budget of the State Department. So we are very underdeveloped when it comes to peacemaking at a time when we so desperately need that. And it's interesting, I mean, I'm speaking to a group now, I'm assuming because I know a number of you, and know that you probably understand that the Ukraine situation is extremely complicated, and that certainly we have to fault Russia for this illegal invasion that goes against the Charter of the United Nations, the Kellogg-Briand Pact, and we have to fault Russia for the brutality of killing civilians and destroying civilian neighborhoods and schools and hospitals. But we also have to look at ourselves and our own government as having laid the framework, created the context, goaded the Russians into this terrible situation. And as I do this book tour, I will be in places where there will be a lot of opponents to this way of thinking, and I look forward to that, because I think we need a lot more discussion in this country and a lot more interaction with people who don't think like we do. But we don't have to go very far right now to find people who don't think like we do, and that is just about every member of Congress, and certainly in the Democratic Party. And it's such a sad moment in history when you feel like, oh, we got Ayanna Pressley in Congress, and we got the Squad, and we have AOC, and we have Rashida Tlaib, and we have Ilhan Omar, and rah-rah. And where are they when it comes to this? Where are they when it comes to just being rational? There's nothing radical, it's being rational about this issue and doing what the Pope just did, which is say, we need to find a negotiated solution to this. But somehow in this atmosphere, when you have a Democrat in the White House, you have an election coming up, and you have a strong speaker in Nancy Pelosi, who thinks maybe it's good to have a war with two large powers as she went to Taiwan to antagonize the Chinese. She is keeping her flock in the Democratic Party in line. And I think probably saying, we have an election coming up in November. We can't be seen as weak on the security issues because Democrats are always being labeled as weak on national security. And we don't want to be seen as a divisive Democratic Party. And so we need you to stay in line with us. And that's why we saw this just pretty unbelievable vote in Congress. It blew me away to see $40 billion. I mean, that's so much money. And to not have Barbara Lee stand up and say, war is not the answer, to not have Ayanna Pressley, to not have Jim McGovern, to not have anybody in the Democratic Party to stand up with a rational vote. And the only ones were some Republicans in both the House and the Senate. And Rand Paul, who was just asking for some transparency, saying, where is this money going to go? This is a hell of a lot of money. How do we know where it's going to go? Is something set up in place so that we will have some accountability for this money? And that was just pushed aside. How dare you ask for accountability just because we got out of an Afghan war recently where we had no accountability for trillions of dollars that we wasted to let the Taliban come in and take over again. And it's interesting looking at some of the reasons that 57 Republicans voted against that. Now, you're always going to get this party politics going on. So when you have a Democrat in the White House, you're bound to have some Republicans who are protesting war, even though they tend to love wars and be even more hawkish than the Democrats are. But these 57 in the House and 11 in the Senate were all over the map when it came to their reasons for opposing the $40 million. For some of them, it was simply, I think, to get at Biden. For others of them, it was because we have domestic needs at home that need to be funded, something that we would, I think, agree with. Others had some ideas that we should be fighting the Chinese and not the Russians, or we should be sending all this war equipment to the border of Mexico to secure our own borders. But in the Democratic Party, there was zero. And not only for that $40 billion happened just now, last week, for the vote that went through on Friday, in which there was another $13 billion. And you didn't hear one Democrat stand up. And it's funny because they told us it was part of this continuing resolution to keep the government going, so we couldn't vote against it. And yet they put up a fight around Joe Manchin and the dirty energy pieces that were in that and got that taken out. So, why couldn't they put up a fight and say this was we want to vote separately on the money for the Ukraine war, and they didn't do that. So it is interesting to see that so far the voices of elected officials that are speaking out about this are coming only from the Republican Party at this point, none from the Democrats. And yet the American people, even though they've been fed a constant diet of very one-sided war propaganda, they are starting to see through this, as we have seen in the poll that the Quincy Institute, which is an organization quite recent that came together with money from both the left and the right to say we have to find a way to demilitarize our foreign policy. And that poll came out and said that 57% of the American people want to see negotiations, even if it means a compromise with Russia. And I don't talk like this when I'm in a different crowd, but since we're among friends here, you really have to scratch your head and say, do the American people really care where the line in Donbass is going to be drawn? Is that something that is a national security issue for the United States? And yet, the way that this is being posed in the U.S. is that the defense of Ukraine is a national security issue for the United States. And it's also been very sad to see how The U.S. has helped to quash negotiations that started in the end of March, the beginning of April, and how the U.S. position of constantly throwing more money into this really creates a disincentive for Ukraine to negotiate, and how Zelensky himself, who had campaigned on a platform of peace and said that he was going to resolve the conflict in Donbass and wanted to see the Minsk Accords that were agreed upon in 2015 but were not implemented, that he wanted to see them implemented. Not only did he get pushback from the extreme right in his own country, who threatened his life, but from the United States and from the UK, who said they wanted to see this war taken to the end meaning how many Ukrainians were going to die in this process, but also whereas Zelensky said at one point that he understood that the dream of entering NATO was just not going to happen, and that NATO was going to have to be a neutral country, has since really backtracked on that and is now saying that he wants fast track into NATO, and that he wants to see Russia, every inch taken back by Ukraine, every inch of Donbass as well as Crimea, which is totally unrealistic. And we don't know what Russia wants at this point. I mean, the horrible thing of starting this war and then going up in the north and the east and the south and going towards Kyiv, and is Putin so isolated that he really thought that they were going to be welcomed as liberators, and that they were going to be able to take over Kyiv immediately and put in a Russia-friendly government? It's hard to understand what his thinking was, and it's hard to understand what his thinking is now. But as we understand, we don't have the ability to put pressure on Putin. The international community can and should be putting more pressure on Putin, but we should be able to change our own government, and that's our responsibility. And when you see how difficult it is for us to even influence our progressives in government, you recognize how there is this tremendous disconnect between not only what the people are beginning to think, but what are our real needs in this country versus the $60-something billion that we have already allocated for Ukraine. So it is interesting to see what are the voices that are speaking out on our side now. And certainly there are people like academics, there are Noam Chomsky and even the realists who are not particularly progressives like John Mersheimer, who I don't know if you've all seen some of his talks that have been marvelous, but I was shocked when I saw him saying about how China was the real adversary of the United States. So he is no peacenik. He's not in the same mindset, I think, as many of us here, but he has done a very good job of explaining the U.S. involvement in creating the context for this war. And then you also have one of the only places in the mainstream news where you can hear an alternative opinion is on Fox News, and is Tucker Carlson, who reaches millions of people. And while we probably disagree with him on a whole host of issues, when you hear him talking about Ukraine, you have to go, wow, that makes sense. And I think there are a lot of conservatives who watch Fox News who are saying, wow, that makes sense. And he's not the only one. There are others on Fox News that are starting to come around to this position as well, including an anchor named Will Cain. And when I listened to what he's had to say, I was like, amazing, because his whole thing was, is the defense of Ukraine worth risking a nuclear apocalypse? And he's reaching millions and millions of Americans. I mean, there might be conservative people, but we need people to hear that message. And then, lo and behold, comes Donald Trump very recently, He's not allowed to tweet, so he didn't put it out on Twitter, but he did put it out in social media saying that this war needs to find a negotiated solution. It's a disaster for Ukraine and for the entire world. And then he put himself forward and said, maybe I could solve this problem. And he has also said that were he president, this wouldn't be happening. And I think a lot of people believe that, and I think it might be true, because I think he would have talked to Putin, whereas Biden is refusing to talk to Putin and makes it like, I'm so strong, I refuse to talk to Putin, whereas I do think that Trump would have jumped at the chance to try to negotiate this. So we also have Elon Musk. Did anybody see his latest entry into this? You did see that? Yeah. Yeah, so he put forward his peace plan, which is great. And it is wonderful that somebody with so many millions of followers is also saying we need some rationality in this. In terms of peace plans, as we go into great detail in the book, the contours of a peace plan are known. There is certainly the Minsk agreement itself, which deals with the Donbas region. There is issue about giving the Russian speakers the full rights that they deserve living in those areas. There's the issue of disarmament, which should include U.S. Armaments that are in Romania and in Poland, and are a threat to Russia. And, of course, Russia returning at least to the position it was at before this war began. And there are good people to lead these mediations, and there have been some successful negotiations on specific issues. Because one of the things you hear all the time is, Putin is a monster, Putin is irrational, and you can't have negotiations with this guy. And we look to the areas where there have been negotiations already. I mean, first we could go outside of Ukraine and talk about negotiations that we've had on arms deals that Putin has been part of, and they have been agreed upon. We can talk about the Iran nuclear deal that the Russians were part of and signed off on. And then the U.S., of course, came back in under Trump and reneged on its deal. So you do have to ask, can you negotiate in good faith with the United States? But then in terms of Ukraine itself, we have the issue of who knew before this war began how important Ukraine and Russia were for feeding the world? And when folks realized that people in Africa and in parts of the Middle East, like Egypt, were going to have a tremendous increase in hunger because they couldn't get the grains out of Ukraine, this became an international issue. And so you had a mediation going on there that was very complicated to figure out how to create corridors, both land corridors as well as sea corridors, to get that grain out and out in the ports. And while it's not perfect, that has been done, and there are large amounts of shipments of grain that have been getting out of Ukraine right now. There's also the issue of fertilizers from Russia, and unfortunately, those fertilizers were under sanctions, and there was a deal made to lift the sanctions for the fertilizers because it was so important to the global food supply. The problem still remains about banks not wanting to deal with the Russians to be able to pay for those fertilizers, but there have been talks on that level as well. And then we have the issue of the Zaparesian nuclear plant, where at one point it seemed like that was going to literally explode, where there was shelling going on, and both sides were accusing the others, and it was probably both sides that were doing the shelling. And there were negotiations, and the International Atomic Energy Agency came in and dealt and inspected that. They're sending more inspectors in, and at least for the meantime, that situation is a lot calmer than it was before the negotiations started. And then the other area is around prisoner swaps. And, prisoner swaps are extremely delicate to deal with. The negotiations are very difficult in terms of who is going to be swapped for whom, how many people, how's it going to happen, how are they going to physically get out of one place into the other territory. And those have happened over a dozen times in these last 8 months. And so it does show that there are negotiations that are happening and that they could happen. So I think, that leaves us to the point of talking about what is our job, where do we come in, and how do we start building back a peace movement that has totally fallen apart. I mean, some of us used to be very excited about the mobilizations where we could get, before the Iraq War, hundreds of thousands of people out into the street. Now I live in D.C., and around Ukraine, I must admit that we can't get more than about 20 or 30 people out to something. I mean, it is absolutely horrific what has happened to the peace movement. It fell apart under Obama. It became divided over Syria. And now it's totally divided over this issue of Ukraine. And I feel very convinced that this movement is going to build, because it has to build because of the threat of nuclear war. But we are just extremely late in starting to build it. I don't know what the experience in Boston was in the early days of this war, but we started calling people out to say, no war, stop this war, no to the Russian invasion, and no to NATO expansion. And we'd get out in front of the White House, and at those times, maybe we'd get 50, 60 people out, and those who were of Ukrainian descent had descended on Washington, and they were out there by, maybe 500 or 600, if not 1,000 people. And they were getting politicians like members of Congress to come out to their rallies, and at that point they were calling for a no-fly zone, and they were really putting a lot of pressure on Congress for that no-fly zone. And you must say to Biden's credit that he did understand how dangerous it would be, and that would lead into a direct war with Russia. And luckily we didn't go that direction. But in those days, it was very hard to do any kind of protest because we would be overwhelmed by people with very convincing and heartbreaking testimonies about what was happening to their relatives and how we needed to be there to support them. I think these days we don't see those kind of mobilizations anymore. And, maybe it's not yet the time where we think we can get significant numbers of people out. And that's why, at this moment, I think the most important thing we can do is education. And that's why we wrote the book. That's why we did this video. Don't have the video, don't have the book, but but we're trying. I feel like personally there's nothing more important that I can be doing is going around the country talking to people. Here in Massachusetts, and particularly in Boston, you are lucky to have an incredible organization, the Massachusetts Peace Action, MAPA, that has done an amazing job. And I think one of the reasons why you have elected officials who are on the better side on some of these issues is because you have MAPA here, and because you do put so much pressure on those elected officials. So you have Ayanna Pressley, that's one of the few, I think it's only one of 26 members of Congress that have signed on to a letter introduced by the head of the Progressive Caucus, and then throws in this thing of, yes, we need some negotiation. And MAPA didn't support the letter. Code Pink didn't support the letter when they asked for organizational sign-ons. But we recognize that's the best we're going to get from Congress right now, so let's try to get people to sign on to it. And I thought it was such a mild letter that all 100 members of the Progressive Caucus were just going to say, oh, of course. It doesn't say don't send any more weapons. And yet, it has been so difficult. It's been, I think, over a month that letter has been circulating now. About a month. More than a month. And they only got 26 members of Congress so far. So you got Ayanna Pressley, to your credit. Thank you very much. We haven't yet been able to get Jim McGovern on this letter, amazingly. And a really funny story is that I've been going into Congress, which is not easy to get into anymore. You know, you might have seen a lot of pictures in the past of Code Pink getting into public hearings and jumping up on chairs and saying, stop the war. We can't get into them. Now the doors are closed. You have to have a member of congressional staff come down to escort you in. And then you're supposed to leave right after that meeting. And they say first their excuse was COVID, and then it was January 6th insurrection. And whatever it is, they can't even tell us what the reason. Oh, because once they told us when the mask mandate was over in Congress, then we could come in. But the mask mandate has been over for a long time now, and they still don't let us in. And it's so funny because we did a protest outside of Congress to say, let us in. This is the people's house. Let the people in. And there were Congress coming in, and when there were Democrats coming in, they were trying to run away from us as quickly as they could. I remember Mark Pocan, who used to be the co-chair of the Progressive Caucus, very progressive member of Congress. We saw him coming up, and we ran up, Mark, oh, it's so great to see you. And we were filming everything, because we film everything, and we say, when are you going to let us back into the people's house? You're filming this, aren't you? You're trying to trap me into something, aren't you? And we were like, whoa, I didn't expect that. And when Republican Congress people would come in and say, when are we going to get back into Congress? And they said, as soon as we take over the House. It will be the people's house once again, and the doors will be open. So that it's hard to get into Congress. We got in a couple of times when we get meetings, and when we get the meetings, they don't literally escort you out. They trust you, and so, you know. Trust but verify. So they didn't verify, and we then start going to all the other offices that we can go to. And on this Ukraine thing, we had the letter printed out, and we stopped in all these different offices to say, you know, you really should sign on to this letter. We also stopped in one of the public hearings. I haven't been to a public hearing in almost 3 years. I mean, I used to live in that Congress. Our office for Code Pink was in the basement of the Rayburn building in the cafeteria. That's where we met every single day. That's where we saw members of Congress, and we would hound them when they were getting their broccoli on their tray. You know, we would start talking to them. And now we can't go into these public hearings. So, you know, we say, what happened to the word public in public hearings? And so there was a door as we were going by, and it was open. It was to the old Foreign Affairs Committee that I used to love going in. So we just kind of peeked inside, and lo and behold, there was a hearing going on. And so we went inside and sat down, and it was one of these horrible hearings that they have, you know, witnesses that are both hawks on both sides. But it was so funny because they're not used to seeing any public come in anymore. And as soon as we came in, you could see them in the back whispering like, rah, 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 rah. And lo and behold, the police show up and say, what are you doing in this public hearing? You're not allowed to be in here. And they were the police who used to arrest us all the time. And so actually when we got outside, they gave us big hugs, and they say, we miss you. We can't wait till this place is open again. It's like a morgue in here. There's nothing going on. But we went over to the Senate side, and we went to have a meeting with Bernie Sanders' office. And it was a guy who works on foreign policy. It wasn't Matt Duss. It was another key foreign policy person for Bernie Sanders. And we sat down with him. We said, you know, I know this Pramila Jayapal letter is, you know, a good first step. And we need the same kind of letter on the Senate side So who else but Bernie Sanders would you think of as introducing that letter? And he said to me, Medea, we think that letter is tone deaf. And I said, oh, so do we. You know, it's so great. We both think the same thing. It should say no more, freeze those weapon sales, no more. And he says, come on, we think it's tone deaf from the other side. We don't think this is the time to talk about negotiations. You can't negotiate with Putin. The Russians are not going to negotiate. And I'm like, am I in Bernie Sanders' office? You know, what is going on here? What has gotten into these people? And is it that they're just being told, wait until the elections and don't go there till after? Or do they really believe this? And we don't know, but we see these progressives who are going to Ukraine with the leadership of the Democratic Party, the same people who were with us in the case of Iraq and talked about journalists being embedded and not being able to see anything when they went to Iraq. And here they're going and standing next to Zelensky with their arms around him in Ukraine. So getting back to this letter, they have kept it open because they really want to. They'll be embarrassed, I think, if they don't get. I got a message from someone else after you told me it hadn't been handed in yet, that they want to get at least 30 onto the letter before they hand it in. They're going to look so weak just having 30 members of Congress on that letter. But I think, it's just indicative of how hawkish the Democrats are right now, how hawkish the entire government is right now, and how unable we are to address this crisis with the weak movement that we have. So we look to Western Mass, we look to the Boston area to give us inspiration on what we can do. And I'd like to turn it over to Cole and Brian to tell people what you are doing and what you need help doing. Thank you.
Well, thanks. And we should definitely have time for Medea to take questions about the Ukraine war. But our next major mobilization is defuse nuclear war, and it is going to be the 60th anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis, not this weekend, but the next weekend. And the point we are making is that it's now the most dangerous for nuclear war since 1962 on that 60th anniversary. So defuse nuclear war is a new coalition that has been put together and is going to do actions on congressional offices a week from Friday, October 14th, Friday, October 14th. So we're going to have actions in 6 offices in Massachusetts, Clark's office in Malden, Lynch's office in Quincy, Auchincloss's office in Newton, Moulton's office in Salem, Trahan's office up in Lowell, and McGovern's office in Worcester. They're all going to be at noon on Friday, so we hope everybody will turn out to whatever district you are in. And we've got several policy points related to nuclear weapons, ranging from taking the No First Use pledge, to taking your missiles off of hair trigger alert, to stopping building new ones, to signing the ban treaty. So it's kind of escalating from the simple steps to the more serious pro-peace steps. And they're doing it all across the country. There's rallies in like Wisconsin and California and so forth and so on. So that's our next mobilization. We actually have our annual dinner that weekend also on the 15th in Cambridge. So come out. Kendra Lara, the Boston City Councilor, is the keynote speaker. She was the champion of the Boston resolution to end the embargo on Cuba, which passed the Boston City Council about 2 months ago or something. So she's going to talk, and so we'll have a good time. What else? Yeah, Brian's been involved in some interesting stuff too.
So if you all just can't wait until October 14th, there is an opportunity to do something tomorrow that I just heard about. This is another great thing that's happening now that COVID restrictions are a little looser is that there's some campus activism that is springing up. So there's several groups at several different campuses that are now protesting these recruiters that are coming from military companies like Raytheon, like General Dynamics. We were even over at Tufts University last week protesting the CIA, who was recruiting on the Tufts campus. So there's a lot of energy in this, and they're going to be protesting General Dynamics and a few others at Boston University tomorrow at 11 a.m. At 775 Com Ave. That's the GSU building. So if we can show solidarity with the students, I know that they would appreciate it. So that's just one opportunity. And then this upcoming Sunday, we are going to be doing a report back with Kendra Lara as well. Several of us from the Boston area joined with folks from Minneapolis and went on a Witness for Peace delegation down to Cuba to learn about the Cuban system and